Hello and welcome to the large group panel session on recommendations for enhancing social, emotional, behavioral, and mental health support in programs and schools. My name is Mohammed Solomon, also known as Mito, and I'm your moderator for today's session. I'm with OSEP in the Monitoring and State Improvement Planning Division and MSIP lead on mental health, school safety, discipline, restraint, or seclusion. Renee Bradley, who is also with OSEP, will be presenting some office updates on mental health. Amongst many outstanding roles at OSEP, Renee is the project officer for the Pbis Center with the Research to Practice Division. Next slide, please. Or actually, keep the slide. Sorry. A brief disclaimer, the contents of this presentation were developed by the presenters for this conference. However, the contents do not necessarily represent the policy of the department and should not assume endorsement by the federal government. Next slide, please. So now a bit of information on our presenters for today's session. Introducing them in alphabetical order, we'll start with Susan Barrett, who serves as a director for the Center for Social Behavior Support at Old Dominion University and a technical assistance director with the Center on Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports. She also serves on the Association of Positive Behavior Support's Board of Directors and co-leads the development of the Interconnected System Framework, a mental health and Pbis expansion effort. Next, we have Brandy Simonson, PhD, who is a professor of special education and the co-director of the Center for Behavioral Education and Research at the University of Connecticut. She's also the co-director of the National Technical Assistance Center on Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports, co-principal investigator of the National Multi-Tiered System of Supports Research Network, and a senior advisor to the National Center on Intensive Interventions. And finally, we have Mark Wiest, PhD in clinical psychology from Virginia Tech and professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of South Carolina. Along with colleagues from the University of Maryland, he established the National Center for School Mental Health, which is now in its 26th year. He's also partner on the National Center on Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports. For more information on our presenters, please refer to the bios on the conference website. Next slide, please. So the following is our agenda for today's large group panel session. Renee and I will start with updates on upcoming Department of Education guidance. We will then switch to an overview of mental health and well-being, followed by a presentation on MTSS and implementation exemplars. And we will conclude with questions and comments to facilitate a discussion. Next slide, please. Now I'll turn it over to Renee to share more on the upcoming guidance from the department.
Thank you, Mito, and thank you for partnering with me on this work as well. So it's great to be with everybody. I'll say the same thing many others are saying, that I wish we were together. I always love participating in sessions that have to do with social, emotional, behavioral work, and being in a room full of people that also care deeply about that topic. So even though I can't see all of you, I am glad to be sharing this session with you. I hope you had an opportunity to hear our Secretary Cardona yesterday morning, and as a lifelong behavior person and many years here at the department working in those areas, I had goosebumps several times, because it's very clear that he values the work about social, emotional, behavior, mental health, overall well-being in children. And it's so nice to have a leader at the department that values that work. And then today, we had that great fireside chat with Cindy and Katie, and they too talked about the importance of looking at, overall well-being, and especially with what we've been through for the last 8 months. So this is a topic I, like many of you and our panelists today, have really pushed for many years, and now we have a really neat opportunity. So I've been trying to look at, are there some silver linings from, the last 18 months? And Our work on social, emotional, behavioral, mental health, child well-being has always been important, but maybe hasn't gotten the public recognition of how we include and integrate those efforts into our work in schools and programs, just like we work to increase and enhance our abilities to do math and to read and to learn history. So it's a great time. But with great opportunities comes a lot of hard work for folks to do. Mito and I have been involved with a very large work group with lots of lawyers at the Department of Education, tasked with working on a document specific to social, emotional, behavioral health, and mental health of children. We were hoping, crossing our fingers, that we would be able to announce that document this week at several conferences that we're participating in, but it's a little bit later in coming out, and we are again crossing our fingers, but hoping to see that document more widely disseminated towards the end of August. This is looked at as a supplement to the other education COVID-19 handbook volumes that have already been released, volume 1 and 2, and there's an upcoming volume 3 that will also be released. The document that we've been working on internally covers both early childhood and K-12, as well as institutes of higher education. So Mito and I are used to having, the early childhood and the K-12, but looking at higher ed was a little bit of a stretch, but one that I'm really excited that the department ventured into. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the draft. Mito and I are going to share 7 of the recommendations that we anticipate being included in that document. And then we've invited 3 folks that are associated with our technical assistance centers, as well as the TA centers at HHS, to come and share some more kind of action-related steps to the 7 action steps that we will talk about. And before I jump into them, I wanted to add too is what we really tried to do is, I don't think anyone that's in this session would disagree that mental health and overall child well-being was at a critical need point prior to the COVID, the last 18 months, and the conditions over the last 18 months, not just COVID related conditions, but also those conditions out of the racial unrest within the country have escalated the need for looking at trauma, looking at relationships, looking at how we can make sure that children have the supports they need to think about how they feel, how they act, how they handle stress, and how they relate to others and make healthy choices. And it was probably a bad paraphrase, but some of the last part of that is from the CDC definition on mental health that we found was a good kind of anchoring point for our work, because it was broad enough to look at all of those things: how we think, how we feel, and how we act, all very important components when we look at enhancing the work in our schools and programs. And we've tried really hard to focus on action steps. So when you see the document, hopefully it will be organized around some of these recommendations that we're sharing with you today, and organized in a way that it's really clear what educators can do. And when we talk about educators, we're talking about teachers and providers and principals and district support staff, educators in a broad term. So I'm going to share these first 4, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Mito, to talk a little bit about the other 3. So the first one is prioritizing wellness for each and every child, student, educator, and provider. And originally on this, I will say that our discussions were more centered on what we could do for children and students. And it became very obvious that the same types of supports we need to offer for children and students, we also need to offer for educators and providers. I was so thrilled with Cornelius's opening remarks yesterday. And, one of the things he talked about was it's not just taking care of the kids, it's taking care of the people that take care of the kids. And so how do we look at doing wellness checks? How do we make sure that we're using data like on climate and satisfaction and teacher attendance and kid attendance? And how do we help form more healthy habits and relationships, not just student to student, but student to teacher, teacher to student, all of those relationships. So how we prioritize wellness, not only for the children that we serve, but also for those that are in the trenches with them on a day-to-day basis. The second recommendation looks at enhancing mental health literacy and reducing the stigma and other barriers to access. And the big key here is how do we look at access to mental health supports? And really, are there some steps that we can take to eliminate this stigma around seeking support? Defining mental health broadly helps us in this way because we're looking at, when we think about it, and I'll talk about MTSS in just a minute, but when we think about it as, different levels of support, really everybody needs mental health supports. So how do we work on it to try to kind of pull out the stigma associated that it is a problem that has to be solved, and more that it is an enhancement that we help people to do a better job navigating their life. And the other big part of this will be looking at, when we look at barriers to access, how do we work on more integration between schools and programs and community services. And I hope Susan will talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. The next one is looking at implementing a continuum of evidence-based practices. And this is where I think special education, although not perfect at all, has done a really nice job of looking at MTSS as a structure for organizing our practices. And now more than ever, teachers need structure to organize the practices. When our minutes are way too extended as it is, there is so much that we have to focus on now. So how do we organize our practices so we know where to best spend our minutes, and how do we focus on the practices that are going to be most helpful? It's a lot of discussion about screening in this area and what that looks like as we go back to school. So how do we not only screen for academic, performance of kids, but how do we also look at their social, emotional, behavioral, overall wellness as a screener as well? And there's also been a lot of discussion about should we just focus on social, emotional, and mental health? But that behavioral health component is a very large a need for many of our kids. In a discussion not too long ago, we were talking about, why do kids often get excluded from the learning environment? And excluded from the learning environment often results because they are not meeting the behavioral expectations in that environment. So working on the relationships, working on feelings, but we also have to work on the behaviors and actions. And the last one here is to establish an integrated framework so that we can have educational, social, emotional, behavioral, mental health supports, that it's not that some people get some and others don't, but how can we look at a kind of overall wellness and health approach to educating our children? We know that schools are the best place to try to do this integration because that's where most kids are during the day. And we've gotten much better at looking at the importance of a successful learning environment and setting up that environment, not just that some kids can be successful, but that all kids can be successful. So that aligned with our kind of continuum of evidence-based practice is a very critical recommendation. I'm going to stop here, send it over to back to my colleague Nito to share the next three with you.
Thank you, Renee. So next slide, perfect. All right, so thanks again, Renee. Our next recommendation, it really pertains to leveraging policy and funding. So here we are really recognizing that the comprehensive mental health needs of all children and students requires coordinated policy and multiple funding streams. So therefore, we see a room to expand understanding of these components to ensure a full continuum of expanded mental health services are provided, as well as the procurement of public and private funding. So with this, our guidance here will look at benefits of early intervention as a preventative measure to long-term services and higher costs, and understanding the state level policy as well as its implementation. The next recommendation looks at enhancing workforce capacity. We had a full symposium on Attract, Prepare, Retain. So this really does speak a lot to this, but also carries on new guidance as it relates to mental health needs. So here we're looking at resources to address child and student mental health needs vary across schools, programs, and districts. And it often focuses on crisis management and rests heavily on reactive responses to individual child or student issues rather than a comprehensive system of support. So as we recognize this, that program and school staff have limited mental health knowledge and often rely on community-based mental health services for support, we're really looking to build out guidance here that will leverage existing workforce to support mental health, that we're looking to enhance training and coaching, as well as connecting with community colleges, and universities to improve preparation of prospective educators. And then our last recommendation in this drafted guidance is to use data for decision-making to promote equitable implementation and outcomes. So obviously schools, districts, and programs experience significant challenges with collecting and accessing usable data. It includes the high cost of some proprietary measurements systems, also variability in the measures used between schools and districts, insufficient staffing, as well as training and implementation support. And this goes without being said that there's also a fast-paced environment for all of our schools, especially post-pandemic as we're looking into school reopenings. So here, our guidance will really address reviewing school, program, and community-wide data, connecting the review of data to goal, outcome, and action plans, and then using that data to document and monitor child and student progress, as well as integrated universal screening processes, all in pursuit of promoting accessibility through data accountability. So those are our recommendations. They're all part of this drafted guidance that Renee mentioned. We're really hoping that this will come out in late August, hopefully. And now we're going to switch gears into our review of MTSS. Michael Wiest was unable to make it today, but definitely recorded a very comprehensive video walking through all of their slides. So I will now turn it over to that video. Thank you.
OSEP leaders and project directors, I'm Mark Wiest. I'm a professor at the University of South Carolina. You can see the title of my talk today. I have no conflicts of interest. This is what I'll cover. I'll talk about school mental health in the United States. I'll present on our interconnected systems framework for school mental health and positive behavioral interventions and supports, which we've been working on for about 15 years. We'll discuss the impact of the pandemic on students, talk about other factors in the 2022 context, and discuss some directions for moving forward with thanks to my colleague, Kathy Short from School Mental Health Ontario. I got involved in school mental health back in the early 90s. I'm a clinical psychologist, but my initial position was working in the schools in Baltimore. We're developing school health centers, and as we opened them, we realized the number one need for students was related to unmet mental health issues. That led to the development of this expanded school mental health model that really grew in Baltimore and in other cities around the country, other areas around the country back in the early 90s. You can see this notion of a shared agenda, family, school, mental health system partnership, interacting with other community collaborators, and the community professionals augmenting the work of school-employed staff. We were fortunate in 1995 to receive funding for a national center on school mental health from the Maternal and Child Health Bureau. 2 centers were funded back then at University of Maryland, where I was, and University of California, Los Angeles, also 5 states to build infrastructure for school mental health. You can see South Carolina is one of those states, and that's where I am now. And the National Center for School Mental Health is in its 26th year of funding and doing very well, and you can see the website. Some of the early data documenting the importance of school mental health. This is a study by Catron, Harris, and Weiss in Tennessee, documenting that when more comprehensive school mental health services were offered to students in schools, you can see 96% received them. But when students were referred out for services in clinics, only 13% actually received care. This is another study a little bit later by Mark Atkins and colleagues in Chicago. A little bit different initial enrollment rate, but then look at the retention rate at 3-month follow-up. All of those students seen in a comprehensive school mental health program were still being seen, and 0% were being seen in clinics. And that's something that we see. We see a precipitous drop off of care when students are referred out to specialty clinics. Over the past 25 years or so, there's been a growing literature documenting the many benefits of school mental health, including significantly improved access, improved early identification intervention, reducing and removing barriers to learning, and achieving valued social, emotional, behavioral, and academic outcomes. Just one of the studies that I found is shared. The caveat is when done well, and we want to avoid a co-located strategy where you have clinicians come in, let's say, to a building Tuesday, Friday, but nobody knows what they're doing. Beginning in the early 2000s, the National Center for Pbis and the National Center for School Mental Health began to work together systematically. Prior to that, it seemed like Pbis and school mental health were operating sort of separately. Through that work and with the leadership of Susan Barrett, who will talk to you later, and Lucille Eber, we developed an ebook on an interconnected system framework for school mental health and Pbis. And this covers core aspects of the ISF, clinicians coming into schools, being on teams, well-done teams, using data, choosing evidence-based practices, implementing them, refining them, aligning programs, a vantage point from a building, a district, a state. This came out in 2013 and is a widely downloaded document. And there's been an updated version of the ISF ebook that came out in 2019. And in this panel, Susan Barrett will talk to you more about the ISF. The key component of the ISF is doing better with data management and screening. This is a study as part of a larger randomized trial. Joni Splett led this study where schools will typically do screening based on observation. A student is late, a student has attendance problems, a student is getting into discipline issues, a student is failing. That will lead to perhaps referral for more intensive services, for example, tier 2 early intervention or tier 3 treatment services within the multi-tiered system of support. When you add a systematic screener, you'll add about 18%, or you go from 10 to about 28% of students presenting significant needs. And in that additional 18%, about half of the students presented really significant needs, especially in the areas of depression, anxiety, trauma, internalizing issues that are more likely to operate under the radar. So as we ramp up screening, and we believe rates of problems now post-pandemic are higher, and I'll touch on that later. Imagine a fluid continuum of student need. So in screeners, and the one that we use for the study, you can pull out subscales: anxiety, depression, attention problems, conduct aggression, adaptive behavior. You can see at the top, they have all of those issues: internalizing, externalizing, low adaptive behavior. They have chronic problems. The top 3% or so of students in schools often have multi-system involvement. And then down to the bottom, you have, let's say, a student with anxiety, but positive adaptive behavior and doing pretty well. Students will move up and down on that continuum. So a big issue is, how do we fluidly match evidence-based practices to that fluid movement of students along that continuum? This is a large randomized trial we had funded by the National Institute of Justice, 12 schools near Charleston, South Carolina, 12 near Gainesville, Florida. 1/3 were assigned to Pbis only, 1/3 we dropped clinicians in the building, and typically you'll see just parallel play, and 1/3 actually implemented the Interconnected Systems Framework. And you can see some very encouraging findings in the ISF schools. We had more involvement of school leaders and clinicians on the MTSS teams. We actually had improved Tier 1 programming. We had more students proactively referred for and receiving Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports. We had reduced in-school suspension and office discipline referrals, and we actually saw reduced out-of-school suspension and ODRs for students of colors, so addressing some equity concerns. I've been fortunate to be in a lot of dialogue at multiple levels about the impact of the pandemic. This was a webinar organized by the Dutch International Mental Health Hub in March, and the webinar just documented the significant impact of the pandemic. You can see some of these quotes from adolescents: enormous impact, doing my best to not fall off a cliff, lack of trust in leaders. And you can see some other quotes there from staff working with those adolescents. And on the webinar, there was also discussion of evidence for increased social isolation, loneliness, depression, anxiety, eating disorders, suicidal ideation, and admissions for self-harm. The caveat is the empirical data still remain fairly limited, so some of these conclusions are preliminary. I've been fortunate to work with the state of Hawaii and was there recently, part of a webinar yesterday where the young people talked about the impact on them from the pandemic. These are some of the quotes from this leadership group called Malama Mental Health, feeling like folks aren't acknowledging how much the pandemic has impacted them, talking about virtual learning being dull, difficult, and often overwhelming. The impact of losing the boundaries between school and home, not having enough personal time, deteriorating mental health and health. Confidence has decreased, insecurities have increased. Students here, we are here for you from the adults, but that's not really acted on. You can check out this amazing group at that website. Some other observations: there's clear evidence that the benefits of in-person versus virtual school are significant. There's a report by UNESCO that I put up there. There's wide variability in school status and inequities based on zip code, district, i.e. whether schools are completely closed or open or hybrid. We're seeing a lot of arbitrary and biased decision-making. In Hawaii, we talked about who decides which students are welcome back. Many students are missing, disappearing, reappearing, disappearing again. Many students and families are frustrated and just walking away from virtual learning. We know that students who fail in virtual learning are highly vulnerable. And so we have these significant outreach needs for those that have been missing, those that have not done well. How are we going to manage this outreach? There have been positives. There's reduced shame about mental health, increased transparency, increased urgency to address mental health issues, increased support for school mental health. We're breaking down barriers, we're breaking down silos, we're doing more across disciplines and across systems, and we're seeing some real breakthroughs in virtual learning and in telemental health. So I've been fortunate again to be involved in discussions at multiple levels, and here are some of the major themes. The first is the absolute critical importance of the multi-tiered system of support as the anchor for all effective programming and the need for us to strengthen its core features. Brandy Simonson will talk after me, and Brandy will talk more about the critical role of the MTSS. Without a strong MTSS, programming will be disconnected, not impactful, and will not sustain. We know there's a lot of money flowing into schools now, we need to be careful that schools don't just check a box and purchase a program that doesn't get implemented. We need emphasis on mental health literacy, wellness, and resilience all together, and for students, families, and staff. We've been working with the mental health literacy program for a few years now and integrated into a study. Canada really does better with us on this than us on this topic. Mental health literacy, we know, is therapeutic. If you have symptoms and you learn about them, it helps you to feel better. We know that mental health literacy decreases stigma, which is probably the #1 barrier for people seeking mental health care, and it increases help seeking. And you can see these resources on teenmentalhealth.org. And then this is a newer product in the public domain developed by the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center and the National Center for School Mental Health. We know wellness is really critical for everyone. So here are some of the strategies: stress reduction, social support. And if you put those together where you reframe stress as something I can handle and then go talk to someone, get social support, it actually benefits your immune system. You can see some of these others: decreasing cell phones, social media, getting enough sleep, being mindful, being involved in nature. Walking the dogs has been one of my COVID coping strategies. And you can see some of the other ones here. That same impressive group, Malama Mental Health, also came up with some of their own recommendations for self-care. And you can see some really cool ideas by them: laugh more, go for a walk, correct your posture, practice forgiveness. School Mental Health Ontario is an amazing resource. Resilience is a key component of this. As they approach the new school year, they're framing the recovery and support to students and schools in relation to resilience. And you can see some key points here that resilience is really about helping students to draw on internal and external protective influences in times of adversity. We know that we have significant workforce needs. We've been fortunate to receive a recent foundation grant from the Blue Cross Blue Shield Foundation of South Carolina to expand the school mental health workforce, including 3 groups: school employed mental health clinicians, clinicians from community agencies, and what we're calling MTSS specialists, the humans to work at Tier 1 around climate enhancement prevention, at Tier 2 around mentoring, early intervention, classroom support, and at Tier 3 around family outreach, case management, and also outreach for all those students who've gone missing. Another theme is we need balance in the social emotional behavioral academic framework. There will be a press to focus on the academic slide, which we know is very, very significant, but we need balance, and actually where students, families, staff is more on the social emotional behavioral side, and that's probably going to be true for a few years. There's a literature on evidence for what works during adversity. I'm not going to get into this. This is again from School Mental Health Ontario, thanks to Kathy Short and colleagues. But we need to be building our strategies on the literature on what works during times of high stress, such as what we've been through. And you can see the action plan, School Mental Health Ontario: amplify promotive and protective influences of schools, identify and address emerging and escalating student mental health problems, provide focused support for those disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. We know who those groups are. Emphasize the safety nets and social relationships, and build strong communication. And in that vein, we have to be careful to not spend too much time admiring the problem. There is a lot that we've been through and a lot of problems, but we also need to remain upbeat and positive, and we can handle this. We will get through this. This is a really nice theory of action for supporting student mental health as we enter the new school year from School Mental Health Ontario. I don't have time to get into it, but it's really, really well done. And Kathy Short was gracious enough to share it with us. Thank you very much for your time. I'm sorry I'm not available for the Q&A portion, but you're in good hands with Randy and Susan. Best wishes.
Wow, so that was a fantastic video from Mark, as was evident in all of the resources and research he shared. He is a world-renowned expert in mental health, so we benefit so much from learning from him. So I'm Brandy Simonson. I'm excited to be here with you. I wish we were physically together, but I'm appreciating the virtual opportunity. And I wanted to just take a moment and acknowledge that I'm a special educator. And so I don't know about any of you all, but my initial thinking and understanding of mental health was somewhat limited and probably came mostly from a medical model, which was focused more on deficits and identification of challenges than on strengths. And I think as Renee and Mito and Mark all set up, that's for good reason in many cases, right? We have seen a mental health crisis in our country. It's been exacerbated by the pandemic. But what I've come to learn and appreciate from folks like Mark and Susan is that mental health is a strength, right? It's an asset, it's a skill. And when I think of it as a skill, as a special educator, it means that I have skills that I can use to think about how to support, teach, prevent risk. And so all of the strategies that we all know and love in special education and know have efficacy, both at the practice level, but also at how we organize practices, really play into this work. And I was excited, hopefully you all were as well, listening to Mito and Renee talk about the guidance that will be coming out from the department, because to me, it resonated with a lot of what we already know works. It's strengths-based, it's thinking about a prevention framework. And so while I'm with you for the next few minutes, I'll be getting to talk to you about how we've organized and are thinking at the Center on Pbis and some of our MTSS work to think about leveraging those systems, those practices to really support the work. So in the first content slide, which will be the next slide in the show, I wanted to have us center on the guiding principles that we bring to bear when we approach anything in our center. And I think in a lot of the folks we work with, these have resonated and they cut across disciplines and domains. And so whether we're thinking specifically about supporting mental health or supporting academic learning, or supporting students, educators, and families in the return to school, we have used these guiding principles to help filter what are the important things that we can do, because we know we can't do all the things, right? And so if you look at the center of this graphic, equity is centered in all of the decisions that we make. And so thinking about what equity means in all of the facets of that word. I think as special educators, we've often argued and advocated for equity for our students, kids who might be identified with different abilities or identified with disabilities. But we also know and have known for centuries, but especially highlighted with the pandemic, as Renee mentioned, that there's very large concerns in our country with racial equity. We also have seen play out in the news concerns based on gender identity, and sexual orientation. So really thinking about unpacking equity into all of its facets. And when I think about centering equity, one of the frameworks that allows me to think about that in really concrete terms is the MTSS framework. So we'll go there in a second, but I want to walk us around the rest of these elements. So thinking again, centering equity, but moving into the outer bubbles, we're going to prioritize outcomes that lead directly to student benefit. So whether we're thinking at the state level, at a district level, at a school level, or at a classroom level, or in planning a student's IEP, any decision that we make from state to individual kid should be centering the idea of student access and student benefit from support. So holding ourselves accountable to student benefit really allows us to think about how we are measuring every decision that we make. And speaking of measuring, we're going to move into the green circle, which focuses on data. And as we think about, we have used the word data a lot. I think it's one that has become a very central part of our work. And as we think about how we use data, we use it in a few different ways, right? We use data to identify need through screening. Mark just talked with us a little bit about universal screening, and matching supports to students and frankly, educators and families who are identified as in need. We think about using data to progress monitor so that we're making sure that if we are implementing practices that we're actually achieving the benefit we anticipate. We're disaggregating data as we progress monitor because we want to make sure that every subgroup of students experiences equitable benefit. And to ensure that happens, we're also monitoring fidelity. So we are thinking about outcomes, but we're also thinking about screening, progress monitoring, and fidelity data. To allow us to implement practices, which we'll talk about in a second, To allow us to implement those practices with fidelity, not only do we need data to guide our practice, but we need systems that allow us to implement with high fidelity across time. And for those of us thinking at the district and state level, to scale those practices, right? Once we know something works, we want to scale it across classrooms, across schools, and across districts. So those systems include things like representative leadership teams that center stakeholder voice, including families, students, community members. It includes things like effective professional development, so training, coaching, data-based feedback, things like policy, and really interrogating each of those systems again to look for equitable implementation and equitable benefit. And last but certainly not least, we think about practices. And so in terms of practices, we all know that we're supposed to use evidence-based kind of as our filter for what we choose and select. But one of the things we've thought a lot about during the current context and when we are in this environment of stress from pandemic, stress from social unrest, social justice concerns, is we can't do all the things. So we have to not just use evidence-based as our filter, but use these guiding principles to think about what are the smallest number of things that we can do really well, invest in that small number of practices, and implement them with fidelity. So as we think about what that means, that truly prioritizes the need to integrate, right? If we're thinking about supporting students' academic, social, emotional, behavioral, or mental health needs, we're really thinking about having a small number of practices that set students and families and educators up for success. So the way we get there is by looking at organizing those practices within an MTSS framework, which will show up on the next slide. So we have all seen the triangle model so many times, we can draw it and dream it in our sleep. But what I'd like us to kind of center on for just a second is where that came from and what it means. And as you're looking at the triangle, you're seeing everything green, right? Tier 1 is the foundation of all of the work that we do. And if we think about what that means, first of all, it tells us Tier 1 is for everybody. The green goes under the yellow and the red. Tier 1 is universal. It sets all students and families and educators up for success. It also has to be robust enough to meet everybody's needs as a foundation of support, even for students who need more. So if we think about Tier 1 not as a one-size-fits-all, but as a differentiated and robust system of support, we can really set the environment up to benefit all students. And many students, as will show up in the next animation, many students will be successful with Tier 1 alone. So approximately 80% of students will benefit from Tier 1 without additional support layered on. For students who need additional support, and again, this also applies for families and educators, we layer on targeted supports. And if you think about what that actually looks like in your buildings, in your districts, in your states, what that looks like is kind of beefing up or enhancing the critical features that are already there in Tier 1. So if in Tier 1 we're teaching skills, in Tier 2 we might teach those skills even more explicitly. We might teach them in smaller groups. We might increase dosage or increase specificity, but it's the idea of enhancing what's already there in Tier 1. If in Tier 1 we're prompting us to use some of those skills, in Tier 2 we're prompting more frequently. If we're acknowledging, celebrating, or reinforcing our use of those skills, in Tier 2, we might do that a little bit more intensively, or we might tailor it just a little bit to meet the needs of that specific group of students. And with Tier 2 supports alone, we'll capture the next roughly 15%. And then finally, Tier 3 is then layered on top of. So the other tiers of support don't go away, they're just underneath, and they're providing that support for the intensive or individualized supports for individual students. So again, as we're thinking about this, we've seen it a million times, but I want us to remember the idea of layering, because as we think about supporting students' mental health, we will have the biggest impact in Tier 1. So if we want to set all students, families, and staff up for success, this organizational framework helps us really think about prevention and the importance of building skills, building strengths in Tier 1, and then using data to identify and proactively support students who need more. It also helps us think through at the district and state level. This framework allows us to organize our supports for schools, if you're thinking at the district level, and for districts, if you're thinking at the state level. So it really allows us to be efficient and effective in building and supporting folks in the way that they need in the most efficient and effective way possible. So if we go into the next slide, I want to have us think for a minute about what it means to truly integrate supports. So I mentioned already the importance of integrated practices, and that's a huge part of us being able to implement efficiently. But I think one of the opportunities we have as we continue to build back into schools is to think about also integrating our data systems. So we are not just considering in a silo kids' mental health needs, kids' academic needs, kids' behavioral needs, but we can look comprehensively at the interaction of the needs within the school and also in the community to drive our decisions, again, in terms of screening, progress monitoring, and fidelity. The other thing I want us to be thoughtful of is that often when we talk about integration, it falls on the shoulders of teachers, right? They're trained in an individual curriculum. They're trained in a specific social, emotional, behavioral support package. They're trained maybe to recognize mental health risk. But often it's on them to figure out how to put those practices together in a classroom to support kids. And what we'd like us to think about is at the state, at the district level, how do we set them up for success by integrating our teaming and coaching structures? So we're doing the heavy lift of integration, and we're allowing teachers to benefit from having those trained in a way that's integrated and coached in a way that's integrated. So that really does mean integrating our professional development structures and systems so that, again, it's not falling on the teachers to figure that out. And beyond that, we think about additional systems. Some of them I've mentioned already, from leadership teaming to workforce capacity, all elements that we know and think about quite a bit at the state level. So I'm going to have us move to the next slide. So I've mentioned a few times that we can't do all the things. And as we've talked about in our group and with other national centers, as we've talked about, if we're going to hold ourselves accountable to doing the smallest number of things to have the biggest impact, what are those things? And so one of the places we've talked about and really thought about this a lot is in the context of the return to school. Because as Mark highlighted, we know the pandemic has exacerbated needs for mental health. It's also exacerbated needs for academics. So if we think about the smallest number of practices that have the biggest impact, we'll have the most efficient opportunity if we can integrate practices that hit all of those pieces. So this resource document that's highlighted is one that a bunch of national centers, 5 of us, came together to create. And the 5 critical practices that we identified are pictured around the circle. So the first one is around connecting. It's around building relationships between and among students, between and among educators, between and among families, and also with each of those parties, right? So thinking about the small practices we can use to facilitate communication, to facilitate connections, so that even if we're physically distant, even if we are in a remote context during parts of the school year, we're still able to stay socially connected. The second one we've talked about a couple of times already in the context of data, the idea of screening to identify need and match appropriate supports based on need. The third practice we thought a lot about was how to create classroom environments and school environments that are supportive of students' social, emotional, behavioral growth and learning. So things like having positively stated expectations that are high for all students. Things like having predictable routines, which allows us to experience, again, some predictability, which works for all students, including students who may have experienced trauma. Having the opportunity to teach not just the expectations, but critical social, emotional, and behavioral skills that set students up for success in learning and in life. And having opportunities to provide specific feedback and celebrate successes. Of course, teaching is a huge part of what we do. And effective academic instruction is actually a really important protective factor for social, emotional, behavioral growth and mental health wellness. So the kind of relationship that Mark was talking about We want folks to really think about those as complementary needs and complementary supports, as opposed to feeling like social, emotional, behavioral, or mental health is taking time away from academics. We want us to think about how we truly do integrate, because both areas of support benefit students and the outcomes are also complementary. And last but certainly not least, we think about how to use data to continue to monitor implementation, so both monitoring fidelity and outcomes, to allow us to continue to adjust and enhance our implementation to better meet students, staff, and family needs. And in doing those 5 practices, we really believe that we come together with a positive, predictable, and safe learning environment that benefits all students, all staff, all families. And I mentioned we believe because each of those has a substantial amount of evidence behind each of those practices. So again, the arrow that leads to the student and shows students' social, emotional, behavioral, and academic growth is supported by decades of research. So while these practices are universal, this is tier 1. We've also thought in the next click about what it looks like to differentiate those practices for students with more intensive needs. So in the next click, the report that shows up will be one that focuses on how to intensify supports. And that was one that was led and partnered with the National Center for Intensive Intervention. So it's the same practices, but it's thinking about how do you intensify opportunities to connect? How do you screen not just universally, but to identify kids who need the more intensive level of support? How do you really increase predictability and individualize some of the prompting that some students may need? How do we deliver even more explicit and individualized instruction in the teach bubble? And how do we collect data even more frequently to better adjust and enhance our instruction for kids who have already shown us that they need additional support? So in my last minute, I'm just going to leave us with one other resource, and then I'll turn it over to Susan Barrett. So in the next slide, one of the pieces that I've mentioned, but I wanted to come back to, is the importance of tier 1 as a foundation of support for everyone. So thinking about how we can leverage that universal layer, the universal tier of support for each and every student. And so in this resource, we've gone through and talked about some of those discrete practices we mentioned already. And we've really talked about what does it mean to differentiate those, not to implement them at tier 2 and tier 3, but to differentiate those practices within tier 1 to create a robust foundation of support. Because again, we think about social, emotional, behavioral supports or mental health and academic supports as complementary and important to integrate. And with that, I'm excited to be able to tag in my colleague, Susan Barrett, who will give some phenomenal examples of an interconnected systems framework and share even more wisdom than I did in the last few minutes.
Thank you, Brandy. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us for this session. Like everybody on the panel, I can't wait to be face-to-face with you. My name is Susan Barrett. I am with the Center for Social Behavior Support, and I am a Technical Assistance Director with the Pbis Center. I want to just start by, in my section, really celebrating the innovation that we all saw throughout the country this year. I learned so much from many states and districts that I had an opportunity to work with. And this section of the presentation really represents that space of innovation. And I think, to Brandy's point, the trick right now will be how we leverage the systems that we've already invested in through MTSS, and how do we sustain mental health and wellness as the priority forever? You know, how do we completely redesign the system? The other thing I really want to call our attention to, that Brandy kind of quickly walked us through those top 10 tier 1 practices, is that's part of mental health, right? Mental health is this full continuum of supports for kiddos. And it's not just receiving supports in the space of an office by a clinical provider. It's really about designing and adapting the physical space to make sure everybody's successful. It's about being explicit in teaching those routines. It's about making sure we're actively engaging children by having a positive greeting, right? That's part of mental health too. So as we kind of lean into this integration and really think about the small things we can do, I really want you to think about that comprehensive mental health supports that really seep into the fabric of every interaction that we have and any instructional moment that we have. So we are starting to talk about this culture of wellness and prioritizing wellness for all. And I wanted to take a minute to really focus on staff. And I was geeking out about this new report that's come out from RAND. And in the next slide, it shows and highlights some of the survey information that was gathered this past spring. And I think we recognize, of course, that teaching has always been a very stressful occupation, even before COVID-19. In fact, relative to other professionals in other sectors, educators experience significantly more stress and suffer more often from mental health problems. In fact, 61% of educators before COVID reported that their work is always or often stressful. And we know that this has a direct impact in our ability to address critical needs of our children and youth. So as we talk about investing in a culture of wellness, it's going to be really important for us to focus on differentiating supports for teachers, for leaders, for our support staff, and making sure that we're co-designing the redesign efforts side by side and listening to them in real time in terms of how we restructure and reorganize. It's time for us to move beyond talking about staff wellness and self-care and talk about collective care and organizational health. Because we're in some serious trouble right now, as you can see from the survey information provided on the slide right now. 1 in 4 teachers are considering leaving their job. And Black and African American teachers are even particularly more likely to leave. Teachers are experiencing stress and symptoms of depression more than the general population. And they're letting us know that the mode of instruction and health are the highest ranked stressors for teachers. We also know that many of our professionals are also responsible for caring for their own children. So this has been a year of all years, as we absolutely recognize. But what I also love about this document that RAND offers us is an appreciation for some of the recommendations coming out. And in the next slide, one of the things they offer us is this notion that our leaders should really be the ones to implement the mitigation measures, so teachers can really have a laser focus on the instructional needs of the children and youth that we're serving. Leaders should also be kind of charged with collecting data in real time about the current working conditions, and keeping in mind that we've got teachers from different backgrounds, and everybody's kind of had different and unique experiences, and really customizing the fit with our own kind of specific needs, but really relying on that data. In the next slide, they also cover some recommendations around making sure that we are co-designing side by side with teachers, that we are using a variety of mental health and wellness supports. And then again, it shouldn't fall on the shoulders of the teachers to try to figure out. It's really up to the district leaders and state leaders who are removing the stressors, like access to childcare. That will alleviate the stress in terms of promoting teacher retention. They also offer us information related to how to use the extra dollars from the American Rescue Plan on using child care assistance and elevating the EAP, the employee assistance programs, and really kind of rigorously reinvesting in HR departments to help, again, alleviate the stress, even for leaders, to make sure that we are de-stressing staff to the extent possible. They also talk a lot about making sure we've got the proper equipment and the proper training in order really to be confident as we may have to move in between teaching and learning contexts. So again, a really great new resource that was just published and put out in June. And so we just wanted to offer that as a consideration for a resource. So let's think about prioritizing wellness. Let's think about how we redesign and reimagine the system forever. And I wanted to highlight in the next slide a brilliant tweet offered by Secretary Cardona. I love this tweet because it really speaks to what we've been trying to do for the last 15 years or so by incorporating mental health into the fabric of school. And so I want to read you this quote because this is really what we're after, right? We're after the fact that we need to redesign, and we've got this amazing opportunity to make sure that mental health services are a core part of the school's DNA, right? It shouldn't be something that we think about after the fact or that we kind of put off to the side. We really want to deliberately integrate and pull that into the fabric of our school improvement system and reimagine this space forever. Now, this can seem like a really daunting task, especially in the midst of trying to do so many things right now. So it's going to be really important, as you'll see in the next slide, that this culture of wellness permeate the entire implementation cascade. We need to invest in a common way of work that starts at the federal level, at the state level, and then seeps down into the system. So our students are truly benefiting and growing and ensuring that we are giving equal priority to social, emotional, and behavioral health. At the same time, we're trying to use instructional best practice and instructional approach so that they ultimately benefit. And you know what? Our brains are hardwired to consolidate, right? We're never just learning about English without all these other factors that are impacting our ability to be on task and to stay in tune with what's going on in real time. And yet we've created and organized our system to be very siloed. And so how do we create and deliberately integrate at the state and district and school level so teachers aren't burdened with trying to figure out how to do this inside the classroom environment? And so there's some really simple strategies that we wanted to highlight for you. And so I wanted to highlight first and foremost this notion of teaming. And in the next slide, you'll see that Monterey County in California did this really brilliant thing as they tried to integrate and consolidate and work more efficiently and de-stress this feeling of trying to do everything at the same time and trying to do everything well. And so they took an existing leadership team and they expanded it, and they invited community partners that they had relationships with, but that they were working kind of in a siloed parallel play kind of deal. And what they did is they invited them to join a team, and they moved past just this show and tell kind of team to looking at data together and deciding what to do and how to prioritize what their children and their adults and their families needed. So you can see some examples of who they pulled into this team. And at the heart of everything they did, the way of work was using the multi-tiered system of support, using those core features and making sure everybody was using that systems perspective, that public health model, in order to make sure that first and foremost, the vast majority of emotional needs are going to be met before we kick it up a notch and elevate it to tier 2 and tier 3. So I really appreciated their leaning on MTSS and deciding together as a team how they were going to prioritize. So they embedded it into the fabric of school improvement rather than situating mental health off to the side in a separate team. So we've been talking about the interconnected systems framework, and I wanted to take a moment to take a little bit of a deeper dive into what that is. So in the next slide, we offer a definition. It is the deliberate application of the multi-tiered Pbis framework for all social, emotional, and behavior interventions to be situated through one system. It also elevates this notion that we must have family and youth actively participate and lead and guide this redesign effort. So it's the deliberate application. And most of that integration is going to take place at the state and the district level. Again, to alleviate the burden that we place sometimes on schools to try to figure this out. In the next slide, we wanted to offer a resource. Mark Wiest in the beginning talked about Volume 1 and Volume 2. We just released Volume 2 back in 2019, and I'm pretty proud of the way that we were able to script the moves in terms of how to move through this process, because it can be a very daunting task to try to figure out this integrated logic. But we're really going to rely on the stages of implementation and expand the utilization of what we've learned through our MTSS effort to pull in the mental health system into the schools. Schools are not going to be able to do this alone. So it's going to be really important that we bring our community partners and situate them into and leverage the system that's existed prior to COVID-19. So we've offered that resource for you, and you'll see in Chapter 4 and Chapter 5, we also offer installation guides. So as you pull a district and community team together, we give a step-by-step guidance on how to pull this off. And we try to make it realistic and feasible by doing some incremental changes over time that will really change the landscape again forever. So realizing that we've introduced a new acronym into your life, and I apologize for that, I wanted to talk about, in the next slide, this notion that no matter what you call this, at the binding ingredient that glues and ties all of this work together are really the core features. And so in your marketing plan, as you build a strategy for moving forward, don't focus on this framework versus that framework. Don't get caught up in the acronyms. Think about the core features. Do we have an effective team that's inclusive of our community mental health providers, that's inclusive of our families, our diversified families that we're working side by side with? Do we have student voice? Do we have a diversified team that can really lead us? Let's make sure that we don't sit back and wait for our children to fail. Let's get ahead of it. Let's actively uncover not only school data and the natural data sources we're already collecting, but let's bring that community data in to inform us about where we need to position our resources so we can work much more effectively and efficiently. Let's make sure as a team, we decide together what evidence-based practices we're going to invest in. And let's just invest in one or two things rather than thinking we have to do everything all at once. And let's make sure that there's evidence behind it, and make sure it's customized to fit the specific needs that our children and families and staff have based on data. Let's make sure that we're using comprehensive screening that includes internalizing and externalizing needs. And if we don't have a formal screener yet in place, let's take full advantage of those natural data sources that we collect, that sometimes we look at in those silo teams, but we're not connecting the dots and really getting a full broad picture of what's going on so that we can make sure we're meeting the vast majority of need. Let's make sure that before we invest in something, let's make sure we've got a progress monitoring system. Let's make sure we've got those fidelity measures that we're supporting and training our teachers on. Let's make sure that we invest in progress monitoring systems to make sure that students actually benefit from what we're investing in before we initiate that intervention. And then finally, I know that we are trying to recover a lot of instructional minutes lost, but it's still going to be very important that we give time and space for our professional development, our coaching, and our performance feedback. And we're nurturing our teachers through this process and making sure we're leaning in and constantly listening to what they need and rearranging the conditions to support them. In the next slide, I wanted to take those core features and I wanted to give you an example of how we're applying those core features in real time. And we're all just so excited that we're watching many of our sites respond in again, very innovative ways. They're hiring social emotional experts at rates that we've never seen before. And I'm so giddy and excited that we're hiring more experts in this space, because the needs have been so great for so long, and the ratios have just been an impossible thing to kind of recover from. I'm excited that we're talking about selecting social, emotional, and behavioral curriculum more than we've ever had conversations. I'm excited about all the training that's going on with trauma-informed practices. And I've been so excited to see the strengthening of partnerships and connections with our families and community providers this year more than any other year. But these responses simply won't be enough. We will not be able to hire our way out of this. We will not be able to buy our way out of this. We need to invest in redesigning the system. And if we anchor hiring social emotional experts to the core features, we're going to ask them to participate not only on tier 2 and tier 3 teams, we're going to ask them to help us strengthen tier 1. We're going to ask them to help build capacity of all staff to bring in social, emotional, and behavior support into the fabric of the academic content. When we select social, emotional, and behavior curriculum, we're going to use a team-based formal process to do so. And we're going to use data to prioritize the skills in that curriculum that our students need. We're going to make sure that all instructional staff give time and space to figure out how we teach those skills right alongside academic content. Wellness is a skill. Mental health is a skill. And we're educators, and that's what we do. And so we can absolutely, with the right type of supports, make teachers much more confident in their ability to pull in some of those social emotional skills right into their math lesson, right into their social studies lesson. But we're going to need to make sure that we give ample supports to guide them through that effort. And yes, continue to strengthen those partnerships, but let's use the problem-solving logic that we've been applying through MTSS and Pbis in order to inform our efforts across all tiers. So I want to go back to Monterey County for a minute in the next slide. And I want to offer that, mental health has been situated in this siloed kind of afterthought. And in that traditional approach, if you do one more click, we saw that in that siloed approach, there was minimal communication between education and mental health supports to facilitate those generalized learned skills, right? There was a lot of mystery about what those, and you can actually click through so we can see all of the words on the page. I got a little giddy with some of the animation features, so I apologize for that. So in those traditional approaches, we didn't really have those communication and feedback loops. Monterey County also built, kind of before they installed ISF, they had a lot of the funding kind of wagging the dog, right? Where they had counselors who were contracted to see only certain kids, and they were focusing more on caseloads. And mental health interventions were primarily provided by clinicians only. And so as soon as a request for assistance came in, it went off to a clinician. We never knew kind of quite what they were doing in that mental health space. When they started to use some of the interconnected systems framework pieces, they started to consolidate their teams, right? They started to bring the mental health providers and their school improvement teams, which helped them coordinate, helped them demystify what mental health was really all about. And in doing so, it really helped everyone learn the right skills and recognize that mental health is a skill. And I, as an educator, have a role to play in helping support my students inside the classroom. The other really cool thing that happened was that mental health providers, instead of being, on the road and working on different caseloads around the county, they were now being assigned to one single school instead of being that itinerant person. And they were embedded into the fabric of the school community. They also offered office hours for consultation and support to staff so they could grow the capacity and make sure that the staff were well taken care of. And that really helped to destigmatize mental health. They also, again, worked collectively as a team to make decisions together about what data we were going to use and what we were going to select in the mental health space, just like in the academic space. And they set up monitoring systems so that they could see the response to intervention in real time. It wasn't just about counting the access to care, it was actually, do students benefit? So that's just a really great example, I think, of moving away from that traditional siloed approach to that integrated model. In another example I wanted to showcase was using expanding data sources. So in the next slide, I know we've been talking a lot about universal screening, but many of us don't have that in place yet. What we do have, though, is a plethora of data sources. And I'm not sure we've taken full advantage of those data sources. Or sometimes we look at data through the lens of a single student or a single youth or a single person. And I think it's important, as we set the context and set the stage for fortifying Tier 1, that we focus not only on the needs, but we also focus on the strengths. And we look at data in aggregate first, right? We look at those general trends and key findings. And so I wanted to offer an example about some of the data sources that our school teams are using and our district teams are using, like climate survey data. And notice that it's not about specific students, it's about the trends. And it's highlighting not only needs, but strengths. You can see other data sources like the Youth Risk Assessment Survey getting pulled into this conversation, academic health getting pulled into this conversation, social behavior health getting pulled into the conversation, and attendance data. And notice that we're breaking, even though we're staying at that balcony view, we're looking at variability across subgroups to make sure we always have permeated that equitable focus. When we bring and situate our community partners and our families and our youth onto these teams, it expands our lens about what's going on in the community and in the family that directly impacts how our students experience school. And when we bring those partners to the table, they also bring a wealth of data that's really been underutilized. There's census data we could be taking advantage of. There's community assets and wellness data that we could be taking advantage of, like green spaces that our students can take advantage of, or connections to faith-based buildings that are also providing social emotional support that we could pull in and have these conversations with our faith-based partners. We also could take advantage of community health indicators, like, for instance, some of our communities or neighborhoods might have elevated lead levels. So the big idea here is that we don't sit back and wait for children and youth to fail. We're actively using that team to uncover the needs of the population so that we can strategize, fortify, and strengthen our Tier 1 before anybody has an opportunity to fail. I also want you to notice that they did some comparison data. And I thought that this was really, really smart, right? The district isn't going to just say everybody needs everything. They're going to say, you know what? There's a small group of some of our schools that need a little bit more support because they don't have health insurance the way that our other families do, or that this community has been impacted by opioid misuse, and many of our other schools and communities have not been, which really helps the district, again, allocate those resources in a much more thoughtful, data-driven way. So, how will love and joy and belonging, in the next slide, permeate every single aspect of what we do? Because we're really talking, when we talk mental health, we're really talking about micro moments. We're talking about greeting and welcoming all students and staff families each and every day, right? That's part of that full continuum of mental health supports. How do we create a marketing strategy and a marketing campaign like we've seen so many schools do around the country, with knowing their name, right? Knowing everybody's name that comes into our school, making sure we can pronounce their name correctly, making sure we know their strengths, we know their needs, we know their stories. And how do we de-implement some of the things that we were doing before that were inadvertently harming our students, like shaming and blaming students for coming in late? So what if moving forward, we keep track of the data for students arriving late who might be absent, but we always make them feel welcome. And we're always happy that they're here with us now, even if there's just 5 minutes left in the class period. When it comes to relationships and community, this is part of that mental health continuum. How do we use micro moments across the day to interact and deepen our connections? When we deepen our connections and we have relationships, the behaviors will set in motion a way for us to actively uncover the need, because we'll look at really small behavior changes or behavior patterns, and that will be a really great data source to inform us about when we need to kick it up a notch. Again, that being active and prevention also means that we're looking at behaviors as signs and symptoms that we need to kick it up a notch, even though it might not pop up on another data source. How do we build routines within our daily schedule, right? That systems piece for social time, for biology breaks, for using a school-wide calming strategy and really pull that into the teaching matrix. How do we identify a calm room or space for staff? Or maybe use morning circles, right, from the restorative practices and huddles for staff to increase their fluency before students join us each and every day. And how do we put fun and joy into morning huddles with our staff? How do we develop a neutralizing routine where we prep and practice our response, especially on days when we feel extra tired and stressed? And how do we help encourage each other to have a calm response, especially when we get in those kind of Groundhog Day moments where we just kind of can predict what's going to happen each and every day? And then finally, how do we use a recognize and respond campaign? Remember, those relationships and the trust will help us look for signs and symptoms before and respond really early on. Look for those behavior changes. Be very explicit about how to get help and how to get help after school hours. And finally, teach the request for assistance process. Identify somebody to manage those requests for assistance so we never have to wait for a meeting to occur before someone can get help. And consider that request for assistance to be bundled, right? That is that when students need supports, so do the families, and so do the families. In the next slide, as we close out, I want us to think about 3 buckets of investing in a culture of wellness. And we've kind of covered this in many of the sections prior. First and foremost, focus on building pro-social community, right? We know exactly what to do. We just have to have the political will to sustain the innovative space and the striking that balance of social, emotional, and academic supports moving forward. Schools will play a central role, but we're going to need our partners at the table to help us. So pulling them into the fabric of the school community will be really important, because we know that when students receive supports in schools, they're much more likely to reach children. We can intervene much earlier. Youth are 6 times more likely to complete evidence-based treatment when offered in schools other than the community. So really focus on that pro-social. The priority for wellness needs to show up in our messaging, but also our budget and accountability system. So leaders that are joining us today, make sure that we're constantly telling our teachers that teaching social, emotional, behavior skills is part of the academic instructional job, that mental health is everyone's job, and making sure that we take an instructional approach. And then finally, focus on staff. The work of integration should not fall on the shoulders of implementers. So really think about designing that organizational health and lifting up that collective care notion.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Mito.
Was
I'll turn it
brilliant.
over to you.
So much. And yes, you and Brandy touched on wonderful points. We definitely have some Q&As in our chat. Before I jump to those Q&As, I definitely want to point folks to where they could find handouts from the session that will hopefully be posted soon. It will be on pbis.org. So once you visit the PBIS Center's website, pbis.org, you'll be able to find handout sessions. Brandy, when we get into our questions, if you just don't mind unmuting, we'll be able to jump in. And Susan, I feel like you addressed a lot of the broad areas of the questions that have surfaced. There was one that was incredibly unique that I would like to start off with, and it really is addressing students and youth that maybe are fearful or uncomfortable with returning to school, and how do we address that? So I don't know if there's support there that you could be able to provide or insight.
That's a great question. I think a lot of our youth are seeing the data coming out in the news right now about ramping up the health considerations and the variants going on. Mm-hmm. And so I think that preparing them and letting them know that every mitigation effort is being used, and even taking some video and walking them through what school looks like moving forward. I think what I heard from many of our students, particularly those who went back so late, is that they were disappointed in school. It looked different, it felt different because of the masking, because of the way that they couldn't just leave and go in the hallway or go see their favorite staff member. You know, they didn't have that luxury of seeking help in those ways. So I think the clearer we can be about how school looks different, how it feels different. I think letter writing campaigns to make sure that there's a personal connection before students start. We've seen some amazing letter writing campaigns and some phone calls home to kind of prep and walk through and make sure that all the questions have been addressed before students kind of return, so it sets the stage for not being surprised by anything when they do go back.
Absolutely, that's great recommendations. Brandy, do you want to chime in with anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, I think obviously that was fantastic. And I think in addition to that, as we welcome students back, we can be really explicit about teaching them the new routines and having them become habits, and finding ways to pair things that are calming and reinforcing with the new hygiene routines. For example, Susan always gives a great example of having a mindful moment while you're washing your hands or using the hand sanitizer. And then I think within the MTSS framework, we can use our data to identify students for whom those universal supports might not be enough, and provide more targeted or intensive intervention for kids who are experiencing truly high rates of anxiety. But I love the simple strategies of setting them up even before they come back, and then as they come back, welcoming them in with really explicit supports.
I feel like that really segues nicely with another question that popped up on how we can integrate families and community members into redesigning these systems. How can we incorporate them? Because we're really speaking in these recommendations to engagement. Mm-hmm. So I'm really, really interested to hear if there's anything there for you all to share.
Yeah, we're watching a lot of our schools go into the communities, not asking our communities and families to come into school, but really identify where the spaces where, those faith-based places where many of our families are congregating. We're setting up QR codes so that we can get surveys from families. We're making sure that we're doing empathy interviews. We're bringing youth into leading a lot of this effort who can connect us with their families. So there's been an amazing amount of things happening that are strengthening the bonds that we have with families and communities, but there's also been a lot of harm that needs to be repaired in some of the communities that we're working with. I think, there were no right answers as we navigated all the complexity of COVID, and I think there's some repairing to do, but I think it's going to be up to us to take that initiative and give time and space for our families to talk about this, to have that authority, to listen, to let them vent, and then to say, you're right, we need to do better, and we want to do that side by side with you, and really setting the table to make sure that they're comfortable in that space.
I was going to add, I love how Susan gave a range of examples that centered family, student, and community voice. And I think one of the pieces that I've learned from some of the districts that we're working with in states is that it isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think historically we've recommended for people to be engaged in leadership teams and through surveys, but the focus groups, the outreach, I think is incredibly important.
Excellent. And those are really great points. I'm weary that we don't have enough time for one more question, but briefly, if you could describe how to advocate that mental health services is not an add-on to leadership, that it is an integrated component, what would that message be?
Yeah, I think that many of our leaders are recognizing that, but I think that it's that cascade of implementation where that common message at the federal level, it starts at the federal level and at the state level, and they're helping to support and guide the leaders at the district and school level to make sure that this stays a priority and that it's completely embedded in the school improvement activities.
Excellent. Thank you. And I do believe with that, we are at time. So big thank you. And once again, all of the handouts and I believe other content will be posted on pbis.org. Thank you so much for attending and have a great afternoon. Goodbye.